The next presentation is by Raaghav Laxman. He is going to give us a review on a very interesting book called A Summary of Air by Dean Spears. It looks at the social, political, and economical factors that influence the quality of air in India. Very interesting analysis done by the author. Okay, about Raghav, he is now an interaction design student in IDC School of Design, IIT Bombay. He worked as an architect for 2 years and he says now he is aspiring to be an interaction designer. He loves cycling, dogs, and posters. So over to you, Raghav.
Yeah. So Dean Spears is basically a developmental economist and researcher who's been working at the Indian Statistical Institute in Delhi, and he's been living in India since 2011. And he's also the co-author of a famous book which is called Where India Goes, which is about open defecation in India. And the book is basically broken down into 4 parts. So he starts off with an introduction to this situation in India right now. Then in part 1, he talks about the short run, which is the short-term consequences and effects of air pollution in India. In part 2, he looks at the long run, where they use computational models to predict what could happen based on the current climate scenario. And part 3 basically deals with government policy and why it's been so effective in India so far. Ineffective, sorry. So in the introduction, he starts off with this important point where he tells us that India severely lacks in numbers when it comes to air quality monitoring stations. And compared to other developing nations in the world also, we have very few of them. So if you look at this graph, it basically plots the particulate pollution by the annual income per capita. So you can see with respect to other nations that have low income also, India is severely polluted. The next graph gives us this important fact that India's air pollution peaks during the winter. And this is because of our crop sowing cycles and the practices of stubble burning. So then he introduces us to this concept of the Great Escape, which was coined by the British economist Angus Deaton, where he talks about how huge portions of the world population were able to escape from poverty and hunger because of development in science, technology, and industrialization. But unfortunately, the truth of the matter is that the world over, and not just in India, most of the pollution, the poorest populations of the world are exposed to most of the pollution. So in the short run, he first looks at health outside hospitals. And in this chapter, he tells us that pollution is not randomly distributed. And he refers to this American study because data is hard to come by from the Indian government, where it was found that the poorest populations of the city were breathing in 1/3 more particulate pollution than the average population of that city. And he also refers to the Lancet Commission report that came out in 2015 on pollution and health. And you can see from this map that India is in the worst category when it comes to risk of people dying because of air pollution. So this graph plots the average child height by infant mortality. And you can see that the shorter the infant is, the more likely it is to die and not make it through infancy. And this fact is important because the data shows that if you look at this graph, it plots child height by particulate pollution exposure in the first month of life. So you can see that as particulate pollution exposure increases, the height of the child also drops. So there's a direct relation between exposure to pollution and infant mortality in India. He also talks about how air filters are looked at as a solution to the problem, but they're very ineffective in India because houses are not designed to insulate outdoor air from indoor air, so they can't keep up with the requirement. And also most Indians do work outdoors. So next he goes on to fields and villages, and he talks about how India is, the rate of urbanization is very low compared to other developing nations like Bangladesh and sub-Saharan African countries. And also that the projection is that only 35% of Indians would be living in urban areas in 2020, and that is also lesser than Bangladesh. So India is going to be predominantly rural for the foreseeable future. So he also refers to this computational model where it was found that so the projection tells us that 3.5 lakh premature deaths from air pollution happen in rural India, and 1.1 lakh premature deaths happen in urban India because of air pollution. So this is a bit counterintuitive because we think of air pollution as more of an urban problem. And these numbers are also a little deceptive because deaths are not recorded diligently, especially in rural areas. So the numbers are probably higher in rural areas. So the obvious problem in rural areas is the practice of crop residue burning or stubble burning. And despite this being illegal, there is no penalty. So he asked the important question of do you punish defaulters or do you reward farmers who comply with government regulations? So there are very measurable consequences for rural populations. And again, he refers to a Brazilian study because Brazil is very similar in economic status to India right now. And it was found that pregnant mothers in villages that were living located downwind from such fires of crop stubble gave birth prematurely and to lighter babies. So he said it's very important for us to invest in human capital because that is eventually what will pay off economically for the country. So when it comes to homes and kitchens, he tells us about this fact that 3/4 of rural Indian households still cook using traditional fuels, which are like gobar or wood fires. And this leads to a lot of particulate pollution compared to usage of LPG. So this graph clearly shows you, it plots lung health by the fraction of neighborhood that uses traditional fuels. So the dotted line shows you the lung health plot of people who use solid fuels, and the continuous line shows you that the people using LPG. So there's a clear difference in lung health when it comes to the two. So Dean and the team and his research team came up with this hypothesis that if men were to switch to cooking instead of women, the switch from traditional fuels to LPG would happen overnight. And they looked for data to back this claim up. And they interviewed a lot of villagers. And since this was a sensitive topic to talk about, they used a very indirect method of questioning them. And they found that families where women got to take more decisions about where to go or what to do, those households were 3 times more likely to use LPG than families where women did not get to make decisions. The other important factor when it comes to social status of the women was whether they give birth to a male child first or a female child first. And they found that when the firstborn was a male, the household was more likely to use traditional fuels. And this was true across the economic spectrum with almost a 3-point percentage difference compared to women who gave birth to girl children first. So then he moves on to the long run and he talks about electricity and economics. So he takes us back to Indira Gandhi's Stockholm speech in 1972, where she argued that India does not have the resources to think about environmentalism right now because it is still in a very early stage of development. But while it's true that the average Indian is still poorer than the average Swede, if you look at this graph here, the life expectancy of Indians has almost caught up with most of the richest countries in the world. So he asked the question about whether we can still use this as an excuse to avoid environmentalism in the name of development. So he takes us back to the Great Escape, and electrification is a key factor in this Great Escape. And it is also a chief indicator of the economic status of a country. So if you look at 1992, we had 51% household electrification, and in 2016 that jumped up to 88%, which is a good sign. He also talks about this example of the 1960s where advancement in medicine and nutrition was increasing lifespans, while there was also high fertility rates. So it caused a population explosion that economists were very worried about and did not know how to contain it. But what they found was that a sort of self-correcting mechanism appeared, because when more of a woman's children survive, the fertility rate automatically drops, because they realize that it is expensive to have more children when they are all doing well and healthy. So that's how the world escaped the population bomb. So the reason he brought this up was to explain the concept of a private incentive, which is basically where the cost and benefit of a decision are borne by the same person or family. So the problem here is that air pollution does not have private incentives that match the consequences for everybody else. So the rich polluting do not face as many consequences as the poor that incur these losses. So he also asked the question of whether politicians use electricity distribution to win elections. And since this data is not recorded or not freely given out by the government, the electricity distribution data, they used night light analysis from satellite imagery. And they did a case study of the UP state elections of 2002, where the BSP won. So what they found was districts that voted for BSP were brighter after the elections, and unlit villages in 2001 were twice as likely to become electrified by 2003 when they voted for the BSP. And the districts that voted against the BSP or for the losing party became darker after the elections. So next he talks about heat and humidity. And he gives us this example of when he was in the Churu district in Rajasthan, 2016, where the summer temperature had crossed a record high of 50 degrees centigrade. And he expected to see some consequences of this while he was visiting, but there were no clear differences in the way life is going on. So he realized that heat alone does not kill, but it works in combination with humidity. So he talks about wet bulb and dry bulb temperature. So wet bulb is basically if you cover the bulb of the thermometer with a damp cloth, which is a more accurate temperature reading of when it comes to relating it to how the human body copes with heat. And the dry bulb is just your normal temperature. So when the wet bulb and dry bulb temperatures are close together, that is when things can get dangerous, especially if it's a high temperature, because a combination of high temperature and humidity is fatal. So they did a computer modeling of a 4.5 degree increase in global temperatures, and it predicted episodes of lethal heat and humidity in South Asia. And the reason why this is especially concerning is because of India's humidity patterns. It is much more vulnerable than the rest of the world. So they also did another few simulations where they asked the question of what if every country went about business as usual without any reductions in emissions. And they found that there would be a slightly over a 6 degree centigrade increase in global temperatures. The next question they asked was, what if India acts alone, eliminating all its present and future emissions, but the rest of the world does nothing? So the results were a bit disheartening because they found that the temperature rise was almost the same, just slightly less than 6 degrees, which is very concerning. So that tells us that climate change is a global issue, and even if India did everything it could possibly do, it will not escape this threat. So the question is, what can India do if the world does not cooperate? And he proposes the use of this strategy called issue linkages, where India could bundle other policy issues with climate policy and impose trade policy or tariffs to punish countries that do not comply with climate policy. Then we move on to co-benefits and coal. So here he tells us that 3/4 of India's electricity is produced from thermal power plants powered by coal, and that the Indian Railways generate more revenue transporting coal than all of the passenger tickets combined. So coal is a very essential part of the Indian economy. But he also refers to the study done in 2010-11, where it was found that India's coal plants killed about 80,000 to 115,000 people and caused 20 million new cases of asthma. So burning coal clearly presents two problems to us. One is the climate vulnerability for future generations and the current threat of health and growth to the current children of India. So it brings about this possibility of a co-benefit, which is basically a climate policy that has the potential to improve some other aspect of human development while simultaneously reducing CO2 emissions. So he tells us that three clear benefits for India if we stop burning coal. One is obviously the health benefit. The second is the overall economic efficiency. So while it might seem counterintuitive, but even though it's a huge part of our economy, if we were to replace it with renewables, which is not going to be easy, it would still improve overall health and early life environments for India's current children, which is an investment in human capital, which eventually pays off in economic dividends in the future. The other aspect, the other benefit is that India could become a leader in climate policy if it cleans up its own act and phases out coal. It would have more of a reputation and credibility on the international stage to leverage rich countries to comply with climate policy. So finally, we move on to the government policy part of the book, where he talks about expert performance. So he takes the case study of the January 2016 implementation of the odd even rule in Delhi for 15 days. So a satellite image analysis was done comparing the pollution from these 15 days to the previous 13 years of Delhi's air pollution. And the results are grim because there was no significant change in the pollution in Delhi. So the obvious reason is because the bulk of Delhi's air pollution lingers outside the city limits and comes from a lot of stubble burning. And so he asked the question of whether the state was just pretending to do something about a serious problem. And then he poses the next question to us, which is, does that pretense actually generate enough optimism and intent to sustain cooperation from the public? So this brings us to this psychological tactic of descriptive norms, where it says that if people think that change is coming about, then they would be more ready to participate and want to be part of this change. But then he also says that lying is not a reliable enough technique to depend on when tackling particulate pollution. So he gives us another example of when the 2014 Modi government came into power. He promised that open defecation would be eliminated from India by 2019, which obviously did not happen, and we still have open defecation in India today. But the thing that surprised most experts and their predictions was that there was a drastic reduction in open defecation, which well exceeded most projections. So he asked the question about whether such political will can emerge at some point to fight India's air pollution. And finally, in conclusion, he has 4 recommendations for the Indian voter and the Indian government. The first one being that we have to build a state that is capable of regulating air pollution. So he gives the example of China in Beijing. In 2001, the PM10 levels, particulate matter 10 levels were at 180, while in 2013, it had dropped to 100. And this was solely because of central and local government interventions and policies. So the second recommendation is that the co-benefits have to be the core of our sustainable development. Right now, India is helpless to push rich countries to comply with climate policy, but focusing on its own situation could give it a lot of leverage to force them into acting on this issue. So the third recommendation is that citizens have to take up the responsibility of measuring air quality because the government is clearly not doing it. So he talks about how Google Maps uses traffic data from people's phones to predict traffic patterns. So he says a similar network could be set up as a citizen initiative where citizens invest in air quality monitors, and they set up a network that monitors air quality all over the city and their towns. And the fourth and most obvious recommendation from this entire book is that we need to phase out coal. And he talks about how citizen activism, though it has been rare, it has been very effective in certain cases. And he brings up this example of the Adivasi protests in the Northeast, which drastically slowed down the multiplication of coal mines and also coal furnaces. So I would like to end with this quote that reminds us all that we all are contributing to this, to the emissions that future generations will have to deal with. Yeah.
Thank you, Raghav. So since there is no question in the chat window, so Professor Anil has shared a recent document published by Michael Murray. Sir, would you like to talk about this?
Yeah, so I actually, in fact, I did have a question to Raghav. So actually, I mean, I'm sorry I was late today because I was watching this documentary and I didn't realize it was 1.5 hours long. And this was actually fantastic, and incidentally on this topic actually. And what Michael Moore talks about is it's actually not Michael Moore. I should look up the name of the author. But what he talks about is the director. He talks about is that actually the so-called green energy is actually not very green, and that actually the 1.5 hour long documentary goes into all kinds of environmentalists and all the people who are associated with the movements. They talk about issues with, well, it's I would say it's controversial because it is a little light on data of some kind, but still they have a very strong point there about yeah, the name of the director is Jeff Gibbs. Yeah, it has come up on the screen now. So, but they are still talking about many controversial issues about, who is supporting all the political and economic. He's, for example, very, very critical of Al Gore, which was very surprising for most of us. Actually, he's critical of many of the environmental movements per se. So, but basically the broad point that he makes is that most of the so-called green energy methods are apparently, at least that's the point of that film, and I'm finding it difficult to digest this yet because it's very fresh in my mind, that it apparently consumes more non-green energy like coal or diesel or other resources to produce green energy, so-called green energy. So, and they are themselves not sustainable at all. Now, there are many arguments that I myself can make about them, but I don't know if the author here has touched upon this issue in the book, that anything that you replace. So he says that it is better to burn coal in the first place than to burn than to use all the alternatives to actually use coal. And this has been something at the back of minds of people for a while, but this documentary actually brings out something very strongly. So, so has there been actually assessments on whether the alternative, does it get into these issues basically, or does he mention any?
So in the chapter about coal and co-benefits, he does talk about how it is important to switch to renewables, but he doesn't really argue against renewables, but he talks about how difficult it is to switch to renewables right now, given India's current state of renewable energy resources and how they're using the infrastructure that's available right now.
Okay, which year is this book from? Because India's renewable energy mix has gone up substantially in more recent times.
Yeah, it's from 2019. So
yeah, so
he says,
so fairly recent.
yeah, so he says it is growing and it is getting cheaper by the day, but the fraction is still just insignificant. And he also talks about how there are so many more proposals for new coal power plants compared to renewable energy power plants, and that is the thing that he is concerned about. But he doesn't get into the cost of like carbon footprint of manufacturing solar
No. Actually, the documentary that I saw doesn't even talk about the cost. He just says that I mean, in order to, he gives many examples. He says actually most of the renewables that people talk about are gas-fed or biomass-fed renewables, so which basically means that they are just cutting down forests, which are alive forests. So it is better to kind of burn coal, which is dead coal, rather than forests, which are living forests, and so on. So he doesn't get into this. He says basically that they consume more energy because you have to transport the wood, cut down the wood, transport the wood, and then so all of that consumes energy. He doesn't give any numbers at all whatsoever actually, or he doesn't give a model of his own or anything like that. but he says that this consumes a lot more energy than uh, and then produces very little of it. So solar produces very little also according to him, and but again he doesn't get into comparisons, or he doesn't get into life cycle analysis or any of that. I mean any of those things. So like for example, my argument would be that yes, so as the technologies improve, maybe we will actually get better life cycle costs than what we have. As I understand, solar energy is improving, for example, substantially in terms of its efficiency and so on. So it doesn't get into all of that, but I wonder if this book gets into it, basically.
No, he doesn't deal with that, but he does give this example of how there is a solar power plant next to this coal power plant that's recently opened in Kanpur, I think, if I remember right. And the sad part about that is that this coal power plant is producing about 600 megawatts, but the solar plant is just producing less than 1% of that. So he says it's a very, like right now it's in a very pretentious state, like these government moves, even when it comes to renewable energy, it's like just to make it look like they are doing something about it. That is his argument.
Yeah, so yeah, I mean, I haven't really seen a balanced view on this on any side actually. And the more I read about it, the more it's just like the COVID lockdown actually, because the more you think about it, should you lock down, should you not? Maybe it is safer to lock down, maybe it is safer not to lock down. If you follow Sweden, maybe there is one approach. If you follow China, it's a different approach. You don't know. I mean, it's really, yeah. So this seems very similar actually. So it's not clear whether the green energies are actually green, and if they are really an alternative in some sense. But yeah, thanks for the summary. It was good.
So actually, we can go ahead with the audience's questions. So thank you, Raaghav. It was very quite insightful and very factuous. And moving on to questions, has the author elaborated on why in rural India the involvement of women in decision making increased the use of LPGs? How does the firstborn child being a male affect this decision?
Right. So the reason why they decided to go out and collect these data points was because their hypothesis was that if men were to start cooking, they would immediately switch to LPG because using traditional fuels is just and it is physically very demanding also collecting such fuel, transporting it, and all of this is done by women on a day-to-day basis in rural India. And the fact that the act of cooking also, they're directly exposed to all these fumes from the stove, which doesn't happen with LPG. So the idea is that the social status of women is low, so they don't have the power to make this decision and tell the family that no, we need to switch to LPG. So that's why they dealt with these 2 points. Like one thing is that when a woman gives birth to a male child as the firstborn, her social status automatically improves because of the mindset in India right now against girl children. So that was the important factor here. And they found a correlation to LPG usage and firstborn children.
Okay, thank you, Raaghav. The next question is, has the author spoken about any initiative being done to understand risk perception of people towards air pollution in India, since there is a lot of lack of awareness?
Okay, so he doesn't get into any risk perception of the public. He mainly talks about how a government policy, even though it might be ineffective, could bring about a change. Like even though like the odd even rule, if it was sustained, he argues that it could have encouraged more people to be conscious about their decisions, even though it was not effective in reducing pollution, but it could make people more aware about the situation at least, and they would act individually.
Okay, thank you. To the next question is, can you elaborate a bit more about public pretense and its effectiveness?
Yeah, so I think this question is similar. So he talks. So he gives us this example of a study where researchers use this parking garage And what they did was at different times of the day, like in the morning, they would intentionally go and litter the garage. And then they would place these flyers on each of the windshields of the cars parked there. And in the afternoon, they would go and do the same experiment with the flyers, but they would remove all the litter. So what they found was interesting, that people were more likely to, when they come back to their car, if they came back to a littered garage, they were more likely to just pick up the flyer and throw it in the garage, just throw it there and continue littering like the rest of the environment around them. But for the group of people that came back to a clean garage, they were more likely to be responsible and deal with the flyer in a more reasonable way, like crush it and put it in their pocket or put it in the bag or keep it in the car. They were less likely to litter. So this is what he talks about when he says that public opinion on something can be influenced by big decisions made by the government. So when people feel like the change is happening, they would want to get involved in it and be part of this change that's occurring.
Thank you so much, Raghav.